I knew somebody was lying the moment I stepped into that water, not because of the flood itself. I've lived through floods before. Anybody who owns land in southern Missouri learns pretty quick that rain is just part of the deal. Fields get muddy. Creeks rise. You wait it out and things go back to normal. But this wasn't normal. The water covering my pasture wasn't clear rainwater. It was dark, thick. It carried scraps of trash, fast food wrappers, cigarette filters, and this strange oily shimmer that danced across the surface whenever sunlight broke through the clouds. I stood there staring at it, boots sinking into mud, trying to understand how 15 years of peaceful living had suddenly turned into this. My name's Ethan Walker, and at the time all this happened, I owned 32 acres just outside a small town called Maple Creek. Nothing fancy. A red barn that needed repairs every year. 2 horses that ate more money than they were worth. A house built back when people still believed walls should be thick and windows should open without electronics helping them. It was the kind of place I bought after spending nearly 20 years working construction jobs in St. Louis. I didn't want luxury. I wanted quiet. For a long time, that's exactly what I had. Then Ridgeview Estates showed up. The subdivision sat on higher ground behind my property. When developers first started clearing trees up there, I didn't think much about it. People build houses. That's life. The bulldozers came. The trucks came. Eventually the families came. Most of them seemed decent enough. Nice lawns. Nice cars. Nice smiles. The kind of neighborhood where every mailbox looks identical and everybody complains if someone's grass grows half an inch too high. I figured we'd stay out of each other's way. Turns out I was wrong. That morning after 6 straight days of rain, I followed the water uphill toward the back fence line. The farther I walked, the angrier I got. Something didn't add up. Then I saw it. A concrete pipe. Brand new. 12 inches wide, maybe more. It punched straight through the retaining wall, separating my land from Ridgeview Estates. Water was pouring through it like a fire hose. I stopped walking. Just stood there. For a second, my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. Then everything clicked. The retention pond they'd built during the subdivision expansion. The endless construction, the drainage work, the grading, all of it suddenly made sense. They hadn't solved their runoff problem. They'd relocated it, right onto my property. I crouched down beside the pipe and watched another surge of water blast through the opening, carving a deeper channel across my pasture. My pasture, not theirs. Mine. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. Then videos. Then more pictures. Every angle. Every detail. Something told me I was going to need proof. About an hour later, I called Ridgeview's property manager. His name was Brandon Keller. If you've ever met someone who can sound arrogant while pretending to be polite, you already know Brandon. The call started civil enough. It didn't stay that way. Brandon, I said, there's a drainage pipe sticking through your retaining wall and dumping water onto my property. A pause, then a sigh. Not concern, not surprise. A sigh, like I'd interrupted his lunch. Oh, that, he said. Those 2 words told me everything. Oh, that. Now what pipe? Now what are you talking about? Just oh, that. I looked back toward the flooded pasture. My flooded pasture. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't some accident. Somebody had made a decision. Somebody had looked at a map. Somebody had seen my land sitting downhill. And somebody had decided my property was the cheapest place to dump a very expensive problem. What Brandon said next would change everything. What Brandon said next would change everything. He cleared his throat and said, the drainage system was approved by our engineering team. The water is following its natural path. Natural. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because sometimes a person says something so ridiculous your brain doesn't know what else to do. Natural? I asked. A 12-inch concrete pipe blasting runoff into my pasture is natural. His tone cooled immediately. Mr. Walker, your property sits at a lower elevation. Water flows downhill. I stared out my kitchen window at the flooded field. So, if I dump a truckload of gravel in your front yard, that's natural too, because gravity helped? Silence. Then he gave me the corporate answer. We're confident the system complies with current standards. Those words kept echoing in my head after we hung up. Current standards. Complies. Engineering. Funny how people start hiding behind technical language whenever they know common sense isn't on their side. That night, I barely slept. Every time rain tapped against the roof, I imagined another wave of water pouring through that pipe. The next morning I drove into Maple Creek and stopped at the county planning office. The place looked exactly like every county office in America. Beige walls, faded carpet, fluorescent lights that somehow made everyone look tired. A woman named Linda worked the front desk. She'd helped me years earlier when I repaired my barn roof. I laid photographs across the counter. She studied them for a few seconds. Then her eyebrows lifted. That's a pretty significant drainage outlet. That's what I thought. She started searching permit records. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Eventually she leaned back. I'm not finding any approved drainage modification affecting your parcel. I felt something tighten in my chest. What does that mean? It means if they altered runoff on a neighboring property, there should be documentation. Should be. She gave me a look. Government employees have a special way of communicating without technically saying anything. Should be. I filed a formal complaint before I left. The process felt painfully slow. Paperwork, reference numbers, waiting periods, inspections. Meanwhile, my pasture was still underwater. By the time I got home, my neighbor Frank Dawson was standing beside the fence. Frank was 72 years old, retired, stubborn, and possessed the unique ability to insult someone while sounding helpful. He pointed toward the pipe. They really do that. Looks like it. He shook his head. City people. I laughed. They aren't city people. They got an HOA, he said. Close enough. We stood there watching water trickle from the pipe. Then Frank asked a question I couldn't stop thinking about. You gonna let him get away with it? Simple question. Complicated answer. Because the truth was I didn't want to fight. I'd spent most of my adult life avoiding unnecessary conflict. Life's hard enough without manufacturing extra problems. But every time I looked at that flooded field, I felt something deeper than anger. Disrespect. That's what it was. Somewhere during a meeting, somebody had looked at maps and elevations and engineering reports. Somebody had known that redirecting water would affect my property. And not one person bothered knocking on my door. Not one. That realization bothered me more than the flooding itself. A few days later, Brandon called me. Not because he wanted to help, because he wanted to know about the complaint. His voice sounded different this time, less confident. Mr. Walker, we understand you've contacted the county. I did. I think we're getting off on the wrong foot here. I almost admired the timing. The wrong foot apparently started the moment paperwork got involved. We're willing to monitor the situation, he said. Monitor what? The impact. I leaned back in my chair. How much damage do I need before it becomes a problem? Pause. Then another corporate answer. If there are verified losses, we can reassess. There it was. The sentence that changed my entire mindset. Verified losses. Meaning my barn had to flood first. My pasture had to die first. My property had to suffer first. Only then would they consider helping. After we hung up, I dug on my property records. Survey maps. Boundary documents. Old purchase paperwork. Everything. For 2 nights straight, I sat at my kitchen table reading. The more I researched, the more interesting things became. I discovered that while property owners could protect themselves from surface water, nobody was required to serve as a drainage solution for someone else's engineered runoff. That distinction mattered. A lot. I wasn't obligated to absorb water that had been concentrated and redirected. And suddenly an idea started forming. Not revenge. Not sabotage. Protection. That's the word that kept coming back. Protection. A week later, another storm system appeared on the forecast. Heavy rain. Multiple days. Exactly the kind of weather that had created the problem in the first place. I stood by the fence, staring at the pipe. Then I called Frank. He answered on the second ring. You finally got tired of being polite. Maybe. His laugh echoed through the phone. I'll bring the backhoe. 3 days later, dump trucks started arriving. Load after load of heavy clay. Dense stuff. The kind that packs tight and doesn't wash away easily. Frank climbed into his old backhoe, like a cowboy climbing onto a favorite horse. The machine roared to life. Neither of us said much. We just worked, hour after hour. Clay. Compaction. More clay. More compaction. Slowly a berm began rising along the inside of my fence line. Entirely on my property. Entirely legal. En tira la mine. When we reached the section facing the drainage pipe, I took extra care. Thicker clay. Reinforced base. Heavy liner material underneath. Everything designed for one purpose. If water came through that pipe again, it wasn't staying on my land. As the sun started setting, Frank climbed down from the machine and wiped sweat from his forehead. He looked at the berm, then looked at me. You know what's going to happen when the next storm hits? I looked toward Ridgeview Estates, sitting quietly on a ridge above us. The perfectly trimmed lawns, the expensive houses, the retention pond hidden behind decorative fencing. Then I looked back at the freshly packed berm. Yeah, I said quietly. I think I do. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I wasn't worried about where the water was going. I was curious and listened to the storm. There was something strangely peaceful about it. Not because I wanted anyone to suffer. I didn't. But because I knew I'd finally stopped suffering for someone else's convenience. Around midnight, I noticed lights moving across the ridge. Flashlights. Vehicle headlights. Then came the distant sound of pumps. Lots of pumps. I leaned forward. A slow smile crept across my face. Gravity was having a conversation with Ridgeview Estates. And gravity wasn't interested in excuses. The next morning, the rain had slowed to a mist. Coffee in hand, I stepped onto the porch and looked uphill. Something was very wrong up there. Even from a distance, I could tell. The retention pond was overflowing. Walking paths had disappeared underwater. Several yards looked like shallow lakes. And near the western edge of the subdivision, I counted 3 separate houses running emergency sump pumps. Water was everywhere, just not on my land. At exactly 8:47 that morning, a black SUV came flying down the access road. It stopped so hard that gravel sprayed across my driveway. Brandon Keller jumped out before the vehicle fully settled. His expensive shoes sank into mud almost immediately. I won't lie, that part was satisfying. He stormed toward me. What did you do? No good morning. No hello. Just accusation. I took another sip of coffee. Morning, Brandon. His face turned red. You obstructed the drainage outlet. I protected my property. You caused flooding. I looked toward the subdivision. No, your drainage design caused flooding. For a moment, I thought steam might actually come out of his ears. You can't just redirect engineered runoff. I almost laughed. Funny, that's exactly what you told me when your water was flooding my pasture. He pointed uphill. People have water in their basements. And I had water threatening my barn. His mouth opened, then closed. No answer, because there wasn't one. About an hour later, 2 HOA board members arrived. One of them, a woman named Karen Mitchell, immediately launched into a speech about community responsibility. Community. That word came up a lot whenever they wanted something. You live adjacent to Ridgeview, she said. Your decisions affect hundreds of residents. I nodded. Interesting. What is? You didn't seem concerned about community when your drainage system affected me. That ended the conversation pretty quickly. Then things got even better. Around lunchtime, a county inspection truck pulled into my driveway. A tall man stepped out carrying a clipboard. His name was Robert Hayes. Apparently, my complaint had finally reached the top of someone's stack. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Robert inspected everything. The pipe, the berm, the flooded pasture, the retention pond, the affected homes. Then he started asking questions. Simple questions. Dangerous questions. Questions like, when was this pipe installed? Who approved the modification? Where is the permit documentation? I watched Brandon's confidence disappear one answer at a time. Finally, Robert asked the question that mattered most. Can you provide the drainage easement authorizing discharge onto Mr. Walker's property? Silence. The kind of silence that tells you everything. Brandon shifted uncomfortably. Karen looked away. Nobody answered. Because there wasn't an easement. There never had been. Robert wrote several notes on his clipboard. Then he looked directly at the HOA representatives. I see concentrated stormwater discharge entering adjacent private property without recorded authorization. Nobody spoke. I also see operational infrastructure installed before final approval. Still silence. Then came the words that changed everything. This appears to be a violation. Just 4 words, but 4 very expensive words. Within days, emergency contractors flooded the neighborhood. Engineers, surveyors, excavation crews, legal consultants. Everybody suddenly became very busy. The same HOA board that spent months telling me everything was fine somehow found the money to redesign the entire drainage system almost overnight. Funny how that works. Over the next several months, they tore up walking trails, expanded containment areas, installed underground piping, reinforced overflow controls, and rebuilt major portions of the retention system. The pipe that had pointed directly at my pasture was removed. The hole in the retaining wall disappeared. By the end of summer, you couldn't even tell it had ever existed. Except I could, because I remembered. Word eventually spread that the total cost exceeded $200,000. Maybe more. I never learned the exact number. Honestly, it didn't matter. The money wasn't the point. The lesson was, by fall my pasture had recovered. Fresh grass covered the areas that had nearly died. The horses returned to their favorite grazing spots. The barn stayed dry through every storm that followed. Life slowly returned to normal. Mostly because the truth is, something inside me changed through all of this. For years, I believed most conflicts could be solved with reasonable conversations. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes people genuinely don't realize they're causing harm. But sometimes people understand exactly what they're doing. They simply assume you'll tolerate it. They assume you're too polite, too busy, too intimidated, too alone. The folks at Ridgeview didn't flood my land because they hated me. They flooded it because they decided my problem mattered less than theirs. That's what bothered me most. Not the water, the assumption, the entitlement, the belief that convenience creates permission. And that's the part ones still think about today. So here's my question for you. If somebody quietly transferred their problem onto your property, knowing you'd be the one paying the price, what would you have done? Would you have kept waiting for officials and paperwork? Would you have fought back the way I did? Or do you think I went too far when I built that berm and forced the problem back where it came from? Let me know down in the comments. Because depending on who you ask, I'm either the guy who protected his property or the guy who flooded an entire subdivision to teach them a lesson. And honestly, I'm still curious which side of that argument wins.